Hello everybody, I'm Rishad Salamat. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, it's not just oil. The Iran war is disrupting global supply chains. The effects are spreading far beyond the Middle East, threatening the flow of goods worldwide. Could the conflict reshape global trade, and at what cost? And the impact could be felt on dinner tables around the world. Disruptions to fuel and fertilizer supplies could push up farming and food prices. Could this conflict trigger the next global food shock? First came the energy shock. Now the Iran war is hitting something even more basic: the food on your plate. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively blocked, shipping lines are suspending bookings, vessels are being rerouted, and supply chains are under strain. The disruption is pushing up the costs of almost everything from factories to supermarket shelves thousands of miles away. The longer the Iran conflict continues, the greater the pressure on businesses and consumers worldwide. The United Nations warns rising food, oil and shipping costs could push an additional 45 million people into acute hunger, taking the global total above its record of 319 million. Could the Middle East conflict trigger the next global food shock, and who ultimately pays the price? Fintan Monaghan reports.
Iran has been threatening shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, a key shipping lane. And disruption to global supply chains is being felt around the world. Some cargo from the Gulf is being rerouted by land. Hundreds of trucks have been backed up at many Middle East border crossings. But redrawing trade routes will cost time and money, and that expense will be passed on to the global economy and ultimately the consumer. Many sectors will face disruptions, but everywhere won't be affected equally.
The spike in global food and fuel costs could leave millions of families priced out of stable foods, particularly in import-dependent countries like sub-Saharan Africa and Asia.
One of the biggest impacts may be on global food production. 1/3 of the seaborne fertilizer trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Gulf nations make several vital ingredients. The cost of two key inputs, urea and sulfur, are up more than 35% since the war began. Even the US, which is largely insulated from many of the trade disruptions, is preparing to subsidize its agricultural sector.
I have been in conversation with the Hill on that as they're looking at additional funds for our farmers. So at this point, everything is on the table. This president is convicted, he is resolute, he will stand with our farmers. He knows that it's a national security issue, and we're on it.
Right now, farmers are making long-term decisions on what to grow, based on the cost and availability of fertilizer. So even if the crisis ends soon, the impact on food supplies will last much longer. African countries are among the most reliant on fertilizer imports by sea, and will likely be hit the hardest. Kenya, Somalia and Tanzania all get more than a quarter of their supply from the Gulf. Sudan gets half. And in places like Gaza, where humanitarian emergencies have already pushed the population to its limits, disruptions to vital supplies of food and medicine could mean the difference between life and death.
On the Straits of Hormuz, I'm really worried about food costs, energy costs, as you say, fertilizer costs. I'm worried that actually further escalation will damage other supply routes. All of this has a direct impact on our humanitarian supplies, including going to areas of key need in sub-Saharan Africa. But more broadly, it drives up the prices, and so drives more people into greater need.
Transport is also going to be hit in regions reliant on Gulf crude oil. Europe, Africa and Oceania may run short on jet fuel as reserves run dry. Some Southeast Asian nations could run critically short of petrol in less than 2 weeks. Manufacturing is also in jeopardy. Smelters in the Gulf produce millions of tons of aluminium each year, and helium is vital to the production of semiconductors. Gulf petrochemicals are also a key input for pharmaceutical factories in India and China. No one knows how long the Strait of Hormuz will be closed, or when trade flows will return to normal. But the economic consequences will be felt far beyond the Gulf region. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
The crisis in the Gulf has revealed how vulnerable global supply chains really are. 80% of goods traded worldwide are transported by sea. Cargo ships need to pass through a number of narrow choke points. Major ones include the Malacca Strait, the Panama Canal, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Strait of Hormuz. A blockage at any one of these places has massive consequences for global trade. In 2024, attacks by Yemen's Houthi armed groups blocked ships from passing through Bab al-Mandeb. During times like these, shipping companies have to spend time and money diverting cargo, in this case, around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. This disruption and another at the Panama Canal that same year resulted in an extra 0.6 percentage points of global inflation that year. Right now, the war in Iran is affecting both the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb. Major insurance companies won't cover ships that risk those routes, which effectively means they are closed. Now, around 3,200 vessels are stuck in the Gulf as a result of Iran's strikes. Meanwhile, charges for shipping containers have risen up to 4 times higher on certain routes because of war risk insurance costs, as well as fuel surcharges. Freight rates between Shanghai and Northern Europe, for example, rose 11% to more than $1,600 per container last week. But it's routes into the Gulf that are seeing the sharpest increases. A container from the UK to Jebel Ali in Dubai that once cost $1,500 is now close to $6,000. Much of that cost is passed on to consumers, from everyday goods to food. Now, Stavros Karamperidis is an associate professor in maritime economics and also is the head of the Maritime Transport Research Group at the University of Plymouth, where he joins us from. From Washington, D.C., we're joined by Joseph Glauber. He's a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. And in Nairobi, we're joined by David Owiro. He's an international development and trade analyst and a principal consultant at the Africa Development think tank. Stavros, let's start off with you. How significant is the disruption that we are seeing on these global shipping routes right now? I mean, of course, a lot of this will depend on how long this conflict goes on for, but right now, what is actually the effect?
Thank you very much, Rhys, for having me in the show. And to be frank, it's kind of difficult to say what exactly the impact is going to be. But as you nicely summarized in your introduction, we've seen that, for example, the cost of bunkers, which is the actual fuel for moving those vessels, has doubled up since the war has begun, from nearly $450 US per ton to nearly 900. Insurance costs, as you said, they skyrocketed. So we can see that long term, for vessels that are trading in the region, but also globally, they're going to have a huge impact in terms of the overall operational cost. And that, of course, is going to be moved to the final consumers, because we have to consider that when we pay for the transportation of the goods, that kind of money will end up to the final customer.
Joseph, are we at risk of food shortages anytime soon? And if so, which are the parts of the world which are likely to be the most vulnerable?
Yeah, no, I think obviously the most vulnerable is within the Gulf itself. They import a lot of food, a lot of grains, oil seeds, vegetable oil, sugar, all sorts of products come through the Strait of Hormuz. And so for a lot of those countries, they are already dealing with shortages, particularly a country like Iran, which was already facing very, very high food inflation. I think the longer term concerns obviously are on the fertilizer side, because it is, as was pointed out in the introduction, such an important exporting region for particularly nitrogen-based fertilizers, but also phosphate and sulfur as well, which is an important ingredient in phosphate production. But those impacts, I think, are much harder to kind of anticipate or estimate what those impacts will be. Fertilizer prices hit record levels in 2022, for example, much higher than the levels we currently see, and yet there weren't very big impacts on productivity gains that year. We had good yields. But the question is, back in 2022, grains prices were really high as well, and now they're really low, and so the profitability margins are much less for farmers. So will they make choices to grow less intensive crops like soybeans? Will they utilize less fertilizer? All those are big questions which we don't have good answers to. I think the immediate impact on, or the more pressing impact on inflation, however, would probably be through the energy sector, just in the sense of, as was just mentioned, that freight rates are up, or shipping rates are up. Also, transportation rates within countries, getting that food from the farm to the retail shelf, there's a lot of energy embodied in that. And those sorts of costs will, I think, have impacts on the overall macroeconomy, but food prices as well.
When you look at all this, and David, I mean, Africa's, of course, incredibly vulnerable here. I mean, countries which are hugely debt-laden, perhaps sclerotic in terms of underfunding with their infrastructure, and also largely a lot of the people who are, let's say, got variable wages, and they quite often have a huge marginal propensity to spend on food.
Yeah, you're right. Africa is particularly vulnerable, given that this presents a compound crisis. Not only is it an energy and food crisis, but also it's finding Africa within a contextual framework where the aid architecture is weaker. There's zero fiscal buffer in terms of social safety nets and government response, and so much of the effects, the macroeconomic effects, are likely to have a much greater impact. When it comes to food, for instance, we've already talked about the high or the rise in fertilizer costs, or even the availability of fertilizer. This is likely to, lead to, present decisions that are being made right now as regards the planting season in East Africa, for instance. So down the line, 3-4 months, when the harvest is coming, it's likely to be a more depressed harvest, likely because of, inadequate fertilizer input, as an example.
Yeah, Joseph, I just want to get your sense of, and David and Stavros as well, of just what actually, it's not just fertilizer. We've got urea, which is used in fertilizer. 33% of global shipments go through the Straits of Hormuz. Methanol, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran produce about, 22% of global supply. We've got phosphate fertilizers, ammonia, sulfur, polymers, and interesting enough, also helium, with which, of course, used in magnetic resonating systems and semiconductors. And Qatar provides 30% of the global supply here. So it is actually much bigger in scale and wider in scale than one would have anticipated, Joseph.
Yeah, I know it's interesting to me. I track these sorts of things as part of my job, and it was interesting. The first few days or so, most of the focus was on oil, and rightly so. It's a major oil exporting region, but over time, I think the rest of the world has begun to realize just how much fertilizer in particular comes out of that region. The other thing is liquefied natural gas, which is a big feedstock for nitrogen fertilizers. That also comes out of the Gulf. So, if you look at a country like India, which is a fairly major importer of nitrogen fertilizers, a major importer from the Gulf, they are scrambling now to find supplies elsewhere.
Stavros, how does this work when it comes to supply chains themselves? I mean, we saw them being rerouted anyway at the start of Donald Trump's first administration with the threat of tariffs. There was a lot of rejigging going on at that point. What about now? And COVID, of course, big part of it. 2022 Ukraine invasion also made a big difference. How does this change the whole dynamic?
As you rightly mentioned, all the crises we've recently faced, supply chains are very sensitive to that kind of changes. So as you may remember well, when COVID hit us, we had to reroute a lot of cargo, and of course all that had a cost. What we see this time that's kind of different from the previous crisis is that the sharpness, how quickly things are evolving, and how with the big impact they're having to the overall supply chain. I'm hoping that we're not going to have any further escalation of the overall situation in the supply chains, and hopefully things will balance a bit, because usually, and as we discussed also in previous crises, you have the first shock, you have the first reaction of the market, and then things are going down. Prime example for is what we experienced today. When we had, for example, during the night, the hit of the main critical infrastructure in Qatar, and of course the oil price and the LNG price has risen by 20-30% at the beginning of the stock exchange, but after that has dropped down because they realized that it's like, okay, there is a big hit, but we can adjust, we can find alternatives. And I think long term we could find some alternatives. The key question is, what are we going to do now? Because as you mentioned, massive amount of not only oil, which is nearly 1/5 of the global oil and energy that's passing through the region, but also other commodities which are critical for our daily operations are passing through the Strait of Hormuz.
David, which countries or economies in Africa do you think are likely to really feel the crunch here from not just the food, but the energy shock which will emanate?
Yeah, there are a number of countries here. So the tier of impact, I'd say around 3. The first one is, of course, those that are critically affected. These are countries that not only have a net food or net energy importers, but also are under an IMF program and have high debt to GDP ratio. That, together with countries that have large urban areas and large urban populations. So those ones that face these are practically Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and those within the Sahel corridor. They're facing all 4 vulnerability factors simultaneously. Second tier is the ones that are high risk. You can imagine these are the ones that have a large population facing crisis of hunger. And these mostly are within the West African belt. So Nigeria comes to mind, Chad, Cameroon, and Niger. The third tier of impact is the countries that are structurally fragile. So these are the ones that do not have perhaps a mode or architecture to deploy a social safety net, or even social safety nets do not exist within those countries. So if you look at Africa, we're talking of countries such as Zimbabwe, Zambia, Sudan, Somalia, and the like. And these are countries that face drought, food, or economic difficulties that compound this crisis much further.
Joseph, have you made any calculations? I know it's a work in progress given the length of time this conflict goes on for, but have you made any calculations on the impact on consumer prices, CPI?
Yeah, Richard, that's a great question. I think it's difficult just because we don't know how long this will persist, and if this is resolved relatively quickly, then I think the impacts will be would be modest. But the longer this is prolonged, and the more length of time that energy prices remain above $100, oil prices remain above $100 a barrel, and I think that there we will begin to see some inflation threat. How much of it really ends up in food inflation? Again, the commodity side of it, you realize that particularly in developed countries, the farm value of food, the retail food, is fairly small. I mean, really less than 15%. So most of that processing, most of the cost of the retail food really occurs after the farm. So that's where energy can play a potential role here.
Well, with everything in mind, Stavros, I mean, if they closed the other choking point, if the Yemeni Houthis got involved, the Bab al-Mandeb, ironically called the Gate of Tears in Arabic, if they cut that off, that would really add this extra choke point. And the thing is, the area likely to be most affected by that is probably East Asia, given they actually import about 80% of the global energy, well, their energy needs from the Middle East. But on top of that, they import a lot in terms of what we've been talking about, these other elements such as fertilizers, urea, sulfur, hydrogen, helium as well.
No, that's absolutely correct. And, it's a very thin balance act that is happening in the region, both in the Red Sea or in the, as you said, in the Straits over there, or in the Strait of Hormuz, because as you can imagine, the biggest issue that we're having, that the VLCCs and the ultra-large carriers that are bringing most of the crude oil, for example, that you could potentially reposition from that area to either refineries in Europe or in Asia to produce helium or anything else that is needed, like fertilizers and urea and all that kind of stuff. They're not able, those mega vessels, to pass through the canal in Egypt. So that's why it's really important to maintain at least the passage in the Bab al-Mandeb, as you said, open, because otherwise it's going to be a real problem. Because thankfully now, with the pipeline in Saudi, some oil products can be moved from the Gulf in the Red Sea.
Yeah, and with all that in mind, David, I mean, at what point do you see actually any effect of this on prices where you are and in other parts of Africa? And if it does continue along that trajectory, would you see political instability also being fomented?
Yeah, so of course, some of the examples that we have already talked about are the immediate impacts we've seen on household prices. So how the fuel price hike is leading to more or higher transportation costs. And of course, with transport goes into everything. So already we have got a positive pressure on cost of living across. And when you have these price shocks, finding already an accumulated grievances within these nations or populations in Africa, for instance, that coupled together with, poor or weak government response, or even a government that's visibly unable to respond, that creates a very highly unstable situation. So already we know that there are a number of pressures, given that there's zero buffer from a fiscal policy perspective, the collapsed aid architecture that's negatively influencing how governments respond, and their ability to respond already provides for heightened risks of instability across countries in Africa.
Joseph, just staying on the theme of politics, I mean, let's not forget that US farmers are going to be paying much, much more for fertilizers. That's going to feed through into costs in supermarkets. Not a good time when you look ahead to the midterm elections coming up, is it? Considering those very farmers are quite often the base of Donald Trump.
Yeah, no, that's certainly the case. And I think for for spring plantings, a lot of farmers in the U.S. buy inputs in the fall right after harvest when they have cash on hand, and they'll buy fertilizer then. So a lot of farmers who are entering the planting season now are probably benefited from the fact that they bought their fertilizer several months ago. That said, there will be farmers who are still buying fertilizer. They will have choices. I think higher energy costs obviously are going to affect all farmers. I think that's the other main thing here, and David mentioned it and Stavros both mentioned, is that these are global markets. So when you're talking about prices rising, they're rising for pretty much everyone. And so I think this comes at a time when margins for farmers are quite low, and they're going to get worse because of higher input prices. The fact that urea prices have gone up 40%, the fertilizer cost for the average maize farmer in the U.S. is probably 35-40% of its variable cost. So it will be a big concern for farmers.
Stavros, we haven't discussed Europe. What's likely the impact there?
In theory, the impact in Europe would be minimum, because what Europe is importing in terms of crude oil from the Gulf is approximately 5%. But as we're living in a global market, or a global village, as I used to say, is that you have, for example, crude that's been destined for other locations, or for Europe, for example, from other places around the globe, and probably that can be stilled, and I can put it in quotation. So, for example, we've seen examples from Nigerian oil or LNG departing from Europe and then making a U-turn while it was transiting to go to Asia, because Asia was offering higher prices. So that could probably create a potential problem to Europe. But of course, we have to see it more holistically. We have also to consider the cost of moving the energy products from point A to point B, because as you said in your introduction, the freight rates had increased dramatically, and that, of course, will increase even further the overall final goods.
I'm going to stick with you, Stavros, just to ask about what the impact of these closures of airspace in the Gulf in particular, which has some of the biggest cargo hubs in the world. What impact is that having? Because that seems like a double whammy. We've really been talking about shipping for the time being, haven't we?
True, even that I'm not a truly expert on aviation, but I have a good understanding about it. Of course, we're going to have exactly the same problem. And the good news is that with aviation, we move like only 1% of the global freight in terms of volume. In terms of value, of course, that's coming approximately 15%. So that means that high valuable goods, they usually been transferred with aviation, because the rest 85% comes with the maritime. So as you can imagine, the big chunk of goods are being transported with the maritime sector. But I don't want to underestimate the importance that freight cargo has, because high valuable equipment that we need, especially during crisis, has to be transferred. And especially as the airspace is closed, that makes the overall operation more difficult and more expensive. And that's why we've seen recently also the aviation freight rates going up.
Joseph, what's your take on that?
Yeah, same thing. I mean, I think in terms of aviation, I think it's important, particularly for the Gulf countries themselves. Obviously, there's a big tourist industry. Those are big airline hubs. in the Gulf, and that affects travel all, for people around the world. So those will be. And the other thing with airline costs going up, it's already an expensive way to ship goods. So it presents even more problems, I think, in particular for getting food into that region.
Joseph, again, just very quickly, do you anticipate any countries actually to run out of food? Not totally, but you know what I mean.
No, I don't. I mean, I think it was mentioned all the various crises we've gone through over the last 10 or 15 years with the trade wars, with COVID, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now with this, the closure of the Red Sea is mentioned. I mean, all these have created big disturbances that the markets have adjusted to, and I think that I don't think that we will run out of food. I think what our countries would run out of food. There may be some short-term problems, but I think the main thing will be that it will just be at a bigger cost. So the affordability question is far bigger, I think, than availability, which I think the market will take care of.
David, very quickly, what are you most worried about?
Well, we've sort of captured a bit of it, being that most countries within the African continent are do not have the pre-laid foundations to deal with this crisis, especially from a fiscal policy perspective, given that there's no zero fiscal buffer, but also the collapsed or collapsing aid architecture that exists on the continent will almost result in more people going into food poverty, especially. And then on the point of instability, given that this impacts at the center of costs of living for a lot of people living in Africa, it will likely add to additional pressures around political instability on the continent. So really, that's those risks are what perhaps might keep me up at night.
David Owiro, thank you. Stavros Karamperidis and Joseph Glauber, thanks all three of you for joining us. And that's our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X at Richard TV and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. Well, that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Rishad Salamat, and from the whole team in Doha, thanks for joining us. Stay tuned now for more of Al Jazeera's continuing coverage of the war.